Hey everybody, Peteaturner, executive producer and host of your Break It Down show. Today's guest is Dave Daley. Dave has been on the show before. We learned about him from our friend Dr. Rich Ledet and Dave's first book that he was on the show for called Ratfucked, and how the state legislatures control gerrymandering, or I should say redistricting, technically, and what that does to our democracy. Dave has been an editor over at Salon in the past, and now he also writes books. His latest book is out. It's called Unrigged, and it's sort of the response to this rat fucking of our democratic rights to elect our leaders. So he's looking at now how people are doing grassroots efforts to overturn these kind of decisions and level the playing field and bring some impartiality and some community into the districting process to try to reduce the amount of rat fucking that's going on. I think this is a great episode, and it just reveals how complex our democracy is and all of the areas where we have to apply attention and effort. And I actually asked Dave, what is our biggest problem? Is it global climate change? Is it this kind of redistricting problem? Is it something else? And he gives a great answer. You're going to love this episode. Hey, if you like what we do, trying to talk right down the middle, understand where the work is, illustrating things from combat, music, politics, anything. You know how we do it. If you like that, subscribe. Really and truly, right now especially, it's very competitive in the marketplace, and my being able to continue to create content rests largely in your hands. So subscribe, tell friends, let people know that we have quality content out here. Hey, the other thing, as always, I'm going to ask you to support Save the Brave or any charity. Ultimately, whether you buy charity on top gift cards or you give your time, your attention, your effort to some other charity, that's great. We'll ask for Save the Brave. Go to savethebrave.org, click the donate tab, put a monthly donation in. If you're already donating, let me know. Send me an email, pete@breakitdownshow.com, so we can thank you directly. Now, here comes my man, Dave Daley.
Lionsrockproductions.
This is Jay
This
Moore.
is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Moranis.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is jonleonguerrero.
Hey, and this is Peteaturner.
Hello, this is David Daley, and you are listening to The Break It Down Show.
And now, The Break It Down Show with jonleonguerrero and Peteaturner.
Yeah, David's second visit to the show, and we've got him back. He wrote the book called Ratfucked, which Dr. Rich Ledet uses a lot in his political science classes, talking about the different layers of government and how just because you own one piece of it doesn't mean that another part of it's not being attacked, which all ultimately comes after our civil liberties because the partisan nature of where we are, especially right now, but just in general, our partisan battle that we're always fighting is constantly undermining our rights as a democracy, as individuals. And it's interesting. So Ratfuck talked about how gerrymandering, and in this case, the Republican Party's state-level gerrymandering was impacting everybody's rights at the national level. And then, so David said, first off, when David wrote his book, people are like, gerrymandering, who cares? That's old news. And he actually realized it was big news. And now we've got the new book, which is due out basically right when this show drops. It's called Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling to Save the Democracy. David, thank you for coming on the Break It Down show. Let's start filling in the blanks. When did you come up with the idea for this book? I mean, obviously Ratfucked is important. Rich makes his students buy it all the time, but Unrigged, when did this kind of come to fruition? Like, I need to do another part of the story.
Thanks for having me back on, Pete. You know, it's interesting. So Ratfucked comes out in the summer of 2016. And, you know, it was great. I got to do, a lot of press and travel the country and talk about it a little bit. But after a couple of weeks, it seemed like, well, that was exciting and fun, but that's pretty much over. And maybe folks will be interested after the next census. And then on November 8th, 2016, something strange happened. The popular vote and the Electoral College were out of whack by about 2.8 million votes. And Americans woke up to a really closely and deeply divided country in which all the political power was on one side of the spectrum. And they said, how did that happen? And what can we do to make it better? And I was able to be like, hey, I wrote a little book talking about how this might have happened. And the book kind of got a second life, and I would go out and talk to these crowds, people who were sort of newly getting involved and, energized and fired up. And I'd go into these rooms, and let me tell you, I would just suck the air out of them. It was like I was the Grim Reaper of a democracy death coming to talk. I could just feel them deflate as I talked about how knotted up the system was, how hard it would be to fix, how long it might take. And I'm like, I've got to find some inspiring examples to end this talk with, or else we're all going to slit our wrists. And as I was traveling the country, sometimes groups would contact me and want to do a table in front of a bookstore or something. And I realized that they were making real change. I went out to Michigan and I gave a talk in Ann Arbor, and there was this group called Voters Not Politicians. They were brand new, and they were trying to get an initiative, a constitutional amendment that would ban the partisan redistricting in Michigan. And it started with a Facebook post. They were, largely millennials in their 20s, and they needed something like 360,000 statewide signatures to make this happen. And nobody thought that they could do it. And suddenly it just exploded.
Huh.
And I realized that there were probably groups like this in every part of the country, and that there was another book here in these big structural barriers that had been placed between ourselves and our democracy, and the largely nonpartisan coalitions that were being built to take them down one by one.
So when you say 20-year-old something millennials, is that code for only folks on the left, or how has the right embraced your cry for democracy? Because I know it's easy to dismiss things because they're bipartisan, but I know you're not about that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, right? Voters Not Politicians in Michigan starts with a Facebook post. There's a young woman named Katie Fahey, and the morning after the election, she was already thinking ahead to what Thanksgiving was going to be like at her house. And she's like, there's Trump voters in my family, there's Clinton voters in my family, there's still people who are mad about, Bernie Sanders in my family. We can talk about, and people cannot hate one another. And she settles on gerrymandering. And she goes to Facebook and she posts, I want to do something about gerrymandering in Michigan. If you want to do something about it too, join me. And it takes off. And suddenly there's thousands of people that want to do something. And they come up with a few rules. And their rules were that this had to be nonpartisan, that they couldn't be posting snarky stories about how bad the president was on their networks here, that like this was not the place for it. If you wanted to do that, take it someplace else. This was going to be about how to solve a problem. And what I think is so amazing about all of these initiatives that take place in 2018. So in addition to Michigan, you have redistricting initiatives that win in Colorado, in Utah, Missouri, and Ohio. You have a constitutional amendment in Florida on reinstating voting rights to 1.4 million former felons. And you see cross-partisan, nonpartisan, transpartisan coalitions coming together behind all of these issues of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And on election day, they pass with these huge majorities that you can't get in this country unless there's genuine nonpartisan backing behind these issues. I mean, in Florida, while voters there elected a Republican governor and a Republican U.S. senator, 64% of the state voted to reinstate voting rights to 1.4 million former felons there. In Idaho, which is, a one-party state, is ruby red is Taylor Swift's lipstick, right? The voters there decided to expand Medicaid for 60,000 citizens who sort of fell into the gap in between the state exchanges and Obamacare, and to sort of take that money. that they were paying, but that their legislature for 6 years in a row had refused to take back. Missouri, Ohio, both of these are, are red states now. I wouldn't even call it them purple states, but redistricting reform passes in Ohio with more than 70% of the vote and more than 60% of the vote in Missouri. It passes in Utah. It's closer there. But it's happening in all of these states. I don't think that these democracy issues are seen by voters as partisan issues. I think they're seen as by politicians as partisan issues. But to voters, they are still a question of basic fairness.
Yeah, right. Like, what does the greater us want to do? We don't even know what that is because the fairness has been ripped out of the system, right? And I've been trying to talk to congressional members on the show and some of them offline. And one of the things that I've asked several of them is, what's the future look like? What bipartisan things are you guys looking to pass? And every one of these things that they're trying to pass are things that we all can agree on. Like, yeah, that doesn't need party involved in it. But just the damned parties can't get their fingers off of our rights because they're all trying to stay alive. And it seems to me that currently today, and these things careen wildly, I think I saw some numbers that Congress right now, that the Republican side of the Congress's approval for the first time in 15 years, and polls are polls, is higher than the Democratic side. And yet we have this massive loathing of who the president is. So do you think, are we going to see a deflating of this partisan base and will, the folks in the middle who are like, I'll vote either way. I just want, look, and this is my own thing. This is Pete saying this. I want to vote for someone who's got good character and who's looking out for the best needs of all of us and who's going to outwork whoever else we might pick. I want someone who's going to just pour their life into that responsibility. I don't care if they've got an elephant or a donkey pin on their lapel. What I care about is the other stuff, the content of their character. Kennedy said that. Martin Luther King Jr. said that. Are we seeing a pullback from this bipartisan? You've been around the country. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I would like to be able to say, yes, the Congress tends to have an approval rating in the teens.
Right.
And yet something like 96 to 98% of these guys get reelected every 2 years, right? So there's a massive disconnect there. I mean, how does that happen? And it happens because we're a highly polarized country. But it also happens because redistricting and gerrymandering makes us more polarized because it sorts us into these uncompetitive Republican and Democrat, bright red, bright blue districts that there is no competitive election. The only election that matters is the party primary. Right. The most extreme person wins the party primary because it's an activist base election. It's usually a low turnout election. It's usually in June or July instead of in November when people really go out to vote. And so you end up with an extreme candidate from an uncompetitive district where you don't really even have a choice, and the other side can't even mount a race and get a decent candidate because there's no hope. So it is complicated to sort of see a way out of that at the congressional level. I mean, unless we can fix our problem with districting and gerrymandering, it's going to be really, really hard to get the kind of action that most Americans want to see on issues. Because I think you're absolutely right. If you look at the polls, I mean, even the stuff that people think is the most, controversial, even if you're talking about healthcare, climate, right, or immigration or whatever, that there's a middle ground that has got big numbers behind it, and there's a path forward on these issues. But we're not actually getting that kind of action because the way that we elect people, it doesn't make it possible. I mean, right now there are 59 million Americans who live in a state where one or both chambers of the state legislature is controlled by the party that won fewer votes in the 2018 election.
Say those numbers again?
Yeah, I mean, because it's a staggering number that ought to ring alarm bells on behalf of democracy. 59 million Americans live in a state where one or both chambers of the state legislature is controlled by the party that won fewer votes in the 2018 election. That is because of gerrymandering. That is the power of these lines that were drawn as long ago as 2011, right? So, 7-8 years later, we are still living with what happened. And those legislatures, not only drew the congressional lines, but they drew their own state legislative lines. So you see these extreme policies coming out of state legislatures around the country that don't even have popular support, but that these politicians are so insulated from the public that they feel like they can get away with it anyway. And I think that one of the really dangerous things that I'm seeing right now is that you had all of these popular initiatives, these nonpartisan coalitions that passed these big initiatives in 2018 on voting rights and democracy issues. And it's not like the citizens felt like they just wanted to spend a year doing this hard work and petitioning and tabling for the fun of it, right? They did it because they didn't think that their government was listening to them.
Yeah.
And these things win. And then the politicians begin trying to find ways to subvert and gut the initiatives that the people spent all of this time working on, because they feel so entrenched and insulated in these districts that they have. This is a real crisis. And when our politicians don't feel any need to listen to the voters, we like to say, creeping authoritarianism can't happen here. But I think if you look around, in many ways, it already is.
Yeah, no, for sure. I don't know if you're familiar with Yasha Monk's latest work.
Yeah.
He talks about how the younger generation is a lot more tolerant to totalitarianism and authoritarianism. And it's a little bit terrifying because we thought we had killed that monster, back during World War II, but apparently we haven't.
Not at all.
When you describe the primary process, I'm going to pick the most obvious person. It's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the representative from New York. She wins a primary. She gets, 15,000 votes. And like you said, these aren't big drawing elections. These are smaller things. And you have a chance to out hustle this thing. And I'm going to be very unfair to Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, but it appeared, at least initially, as if she had no earthly clue what she was doing. And a lot of freshman representatives struggle with the management of their money, and all of these things, because there's a lot of rules and the learning curve. We had another freshman representative, former Green Beret, Michael Waltz from Florida, and he's a Republican. And he said, yeah, you need to hire really good people to help you make sure you abide by the rules, and learning how to work in Congress is a steep learning curve. Plus you have to always work, as a representative, you're always in a re-election cycle. You have to go see and be amongst your constituents. You have to be in the House to go do election work and actual legislation. It's very hard for someone who doesn't have a real strong command of all of the aspects to get caught up. Michael is a guy who's 50-something years old. He's been a Green Beret. He's got multiple degrees. He's worked in the State Department at the diplomatic level. Here's a guy that's highly seasoned, and he's like, it's hard. How on earth is someone who's ideologically focused, how do they get caught up? Okay, look, she's a celebrity and she's learned a lot. I'm sure she's 1,000 times better than she was on day one. But this is a problem when that part of the election cycle brings in someone who, good or bad, just isn't prepared for the job.
Yeah, I think there's some truth there. AOC defeated an incumbent who seems to have lost touch with that district. And I think that people ought to be able to choose their own representatives.
Right.
I think that the danger is when people don't get that right? When the district lines almost mandate who is going to be the winner. And my favorite example here is Mark Meadows in North Carolina. Meadows represents a district in North Carolina that throughout the 2000s is a real swing district. Republicans have it at the beginning of the decade. I think that they take it in 2000 and they hold it, after 9/11, of course. And Democrats won it back in 2006 with the most conservative Democrat in the House at the time, Heath Shuler, the former NFL quarterback.
Right.
And he has it in 6 and 8, and he manages even to hold on in 2010 in the Tea Party wave. But that Tea Party wave gives Republicans in North Carolina control of the state legislature, and they won the right to redistrict the state in 2011, including the congressional districts. And what they did was they took Shuler's district and they cracked it and they cracked the city of Asheville, which was kind of at the heart of it, this liberal city in the middle of these conservative mountain towns. And they cracked it in half. And Shuler took one look at these new lines and he knew he was done for, and he retired. And it was clear that the Republican primary was going to control who won, that seat. So, and there was a competitive primary, and Mark Meadows was a local sandwich shop owner. And he jumped into the primary, and he said all of those things about if he won, he was going to send Obama back to Kenya or
Jesus, yeah,
wherever it is he comes from. And he wins going away, right? And he goes to Washington, and the first thing he does is files the parliamentary notion that takes John Boehner. John Boehner wasn't conservative enough for him. And then he forces the government shutdown essentially in 2013, trying to defund Obamacare. And now he's the chief of staff to the president of the United States. So a redistricting created this immensely powerful person who had been running a sandwich shop, and now he is the right-hand man to the president of the United States.
Yeah, and I love that you used a right-leaning example, because I used, AOC as one, and I because this does happen all the time, and this is
exactly
these funny things happen too. And this is this is just a funny thing, and I just think it's entertaining, so I'll give it to the audience. But when President Obama was not even Senator Obama, Mike Ditka was thinking and considering running for the race for the senator spot, and the polling, even though he hadn't officially announced, you know who wins that fight. So think how close President Obama became to not even being Senator Obama. And then, gosh, the timing on being a president, the window is so fickle. Maybe he never even, so it's these small things where if Mike had said, you know what? Yeah, I want to do that. It would have been his job,
I mean, it wasn't that long ago, Chris Matthews wanted to be the senator from Pennsylvania, and now he's, lost his job on hardball. Or you look at Alabama, and Tommy Tuberville, the old Auburn University coach, had just got, Trump's endorsement over his old attorney general, Jeff Sessions, who'd held that seat for a long time. So, these guys can, the celebrity, their way in. Everything changes.
Everything does change. The other thing I wanted to ask you about is one of the things that we started to realize here on the show as I talk to congressional members and people provide this feedback is, and I'll use two examples to be fair. A place like Kansas, where you have 2 Republican senators, but you have a more liberal. Kansas is driven by Kansas City primarily and the suburbs around there. That's where most of the people are. It's sort of like the mirror image of Illinois, where you have two Democratic senators that represent Chicago, and then the rest of the state really is bright red, like Taylor Swift's lips. Or in California, where you have the most populous state and you have 2 senators, and if you live outside of certain pockets, you have to feel like you have no senatorial representation because of the alignment of the parties. Is there something that you can think of where we can, or is this handled in the House, where your representative is a regional person? But I know as a California guy, I often hear things that my senators talk about, and I'm not against them in any way, but I'm like, that's not that's not what I'm hoping for. Like that's not how I'm represented. So is there something that we do with the Senate? I know Dianne Feinstein's talking about California needs more than one senator because of the size of it. What are your thoughts?
I have two thoughts. I think the Senate is a looming disaster for American representation. That I think it's something like between now and 2040, what you're going to have is 70% of the Senate will represent 30% of the population. So you're going to have most people living in 15 states, but the other 35 states are essentially going to have a veto power over what a supermajority of the public wants to do. Now, of course, California and Texas are two very different states. So, but this is, it's a veto power over a lot of things that we are about to kind of bake into our politics that I think could lead to some, basic questions of just the legitimacy of the Congress itself. I don't think that these are population patterns that anyone ever imagined when they were putting this system together 240 years ago. So I do think we have this growing problem that we have to really look at with the Senate. But I think there's a way to take care of this in the House as well. And I work with a group called Fair Vote that has a plan called the Fair Representation Act for the House that a couple of congressmen, including Don Beyer of Virginia, have introduced. And what the Fair Representation Act does is, I think it would be the set of reforms that would just transform Congress. So it eliminates single-member winner-take-all districts. And you draw instead larger multi-member districts, and you use ranked choice voting to elect the members. And as soon as you draw these bigger districts, you immediately take away the power of the lines to determine winners and losers. And as soon as you draw these bigger districts, you get swing seats all over the country in just about every state. I live in Massachusetts, for example, and our congressional delegation is 9-0 Democratic, and a Republican has not been elected from here since 1994. So it's been a long, long time. But we have a Republican governor who's the most popular governor in the country.
I love
right?
it. Yeah.
And there's only been one Democratic governor elected here since Michael Dukakis. So there are clearly Republicans in Massachusetts. They just don't have any voice at all in the state's congressional delegation. So imagine if instead of 9 single-member districts that automatically elected Democrats, you had 3 districts of 3, and you elected 5 Democrats and 1 Green and 2 Republicans and 1 Libertarian. All of a sudden, the spectrum of political opinion in the state is much better represented. And all of a sudden, the nature of Congress changes, right? I mean, if these single member districts are gone, suddenly the politicians are incentivized to behave differently. And they might actually understand that we're sending them there to compromise and work together and sort of solve problems, not to store up, clubs that they can then use to bludgeon the other side in November every 2 years.
Right.
So, I think we have to think in a big and bold way about how we structure a system in order to get the outcomes that we want. Because as long as we have these garbage systems, we're going to get garbage outcomes.
Yeah, that the garbage in, garbage out kind of thing, it really does matter. And I guess I should say, in a lot of ways, our system works because it does kind of careen, and you really can't, no party can really, it's like a scrum, and it inches this way and inches that way. But because we don't have the ability of a party to truly dominate for long, we don't get a whole lot done, and we're awfully argumentative. But when we all agree, we will all flip the scum around and go somewhere, and make these big leaps. Like I'll think of gay rights for marriage and how marijuana is moving towards legalization across the nation. We'll move quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
as a body politic, but man, it's so the garbage system in its own way kind of works. But you're right, you start to stack garbage outcomes, and this is another thing that I'm curious what your thoughts are. And right now, President Trump is doing, and for whatever reason, President Obama didn't do this, but President Trump is now filling judicial slots in the federal courts at a rate that is alarming if you are more progressive in your political bent. And it's thrilling if you are a Republican and you're more conservative. And to me, as a guy that's sort of I'm a really shitty libertarian, really, it's it's terrifying to me. But also, I also see that at some point, look, the Supreme Court in its current configuration dates back to the middle 1800s. And with all of those judges are hearing cases and things are appealing up, at some point, we get in a really tight bottleneck. And we already know that the Supreme Court is bottlenecked. And I'm not in favor of stacking the court. But it does seem to me, at some point, we have to have more Supreme Court justices just to deal with the volume of cases. Now, maybe there's some kind of rotational 9 on, 9 off. And, but if you double because here's the thing, part of our shitty systems, right? If we look at DAs, there's no DA in the country that runs on being soft on crime or fair to criminals or rehabilitative. I'm the rehabilitation DA. Like, that doesn't happen. So we put a lot of people in jail, or we create outcomes where they're guilty because that's the path of least resistance. People that are in jail for the rest of their lives potentially. And we don't know, far too many times we're like, oh shit, that person was innocent. And we get up to the Supreme Court level, and these cases can't even be physically heard. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on just, how gerrymandering 2 layers out creates this court that is going in one direction, and 2, like the bottleneck that happens once you get above, the district courts, because the Supreme Court just hasn't gotten any bigger. And honestly, how hard can we work these judges? Judge Bader Ginsburg struggles to be in the court for a whole year, not because she doesn't want to. It's hard to stay healthy at that age.
Yeah, and she can't retire, right? Because if she retires, she feels as if that will be, turned into a seat for the other side for 50 years. We've set up system at the Supreme Court that is just, it's dysfunctional. And it's heightened every issue to such a high stakes game. None of this is helped out by the Senate confirmation process becoming as nasty and brutal as it has become.
Yeah.
Where, and if people want to take this back all the way to Bork, they can. If people want to take it through Clarence Thomas or
pick your point.
or if they want to take it through Merrick Garland, wherever it is you want to start, how about if we just agree it's broken and not working? And I mean, I do think we have to do something just to pull the air out of that balloon, right? To deflate all of the high stakes tension that sits around 9 people on a court who are, essentially unelected, but who now sit in those seats for 40 years and will be able to run every aspect of American life if they so desire.
Right.
So I think if you came up with a term limit system, if you came up with, you get an 18-year term on the court, and that means that every president is going to get 2 picks. And all of a sudden, it's the stakes are a little less high because everyone knows that the president is going to get 2 picks no matter what. I mean, if it means increasing the size and coming up with some way to ensure that everybody gets X number of picks, or that, there's 13 justices, but then, it's like a lottery as far as who gets which cases. I don't know how you do it. I'm sure that smarter people than I can kind of sit down and design something. But it does seem like the time is upon us to try to figure out what to do there. Because, I mean, if I were to put my progressive hat on, I would say that presidents that lost the popular vote have picked 4 of the 9 justices on the court and 4 of the 5 conservatives. So, that's an interesting point, I think. We have this high stakes warfare over the court that just needs to somehow come down if we want the body to hold on to its legitimacy, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's some kind of nudging or tweaking has to be there. And I would absolutely be for some sort of with the power of automation. I don't want a robot picking a Supreme Court justice, but we could look at these because we see how they do their justices. We know that Kennedy held down the right and, Sotomayor is more left, that kind of thing. Yep. And maybe you find judges that fit within a spectrum based upon their entire career of decisions. And you're like, now we need, someone in this percentile because we do want to represent these things equally. Because I just want to say one more thing and I'm going to let you talk. One of the things that bugs me about this is we get into this crisis panic mode about right now that the Supreme Court is talking about abortion. I don't know, 6 months ago or so, they were talking about the legitimacy of a law from the 60s that dealt with gay rights. And the court is supposed to do that. They're supposed to say, is this law still relevant, or do we kick this over to the legislature to address, the modernity of this law? And instead of that being a rational conversation, it's this huge political thing. Like, of course, the court is going to go. And I honestly don't remember what even happened with the gay rights part of it, or if they've even put out that decision. But now they're going to kick it over to a legislature that, for right now, at the minute, is not likely to do anything because they can't pass anything unless it's in some weird bipartisan bubble. So we do have this problem of the court has its job to do its thing, but damn, even when they had to kick something over and let the legislatures, revisit that law, that seems to be a really crappy outcome with our desire to look at the legislature and say, yeah, you guys are doing a good job.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at the partisan gerrymandering decision that came down from the courts last year, 5-4 case, Roberts writing the decision, and in the North Carolina case, that was one of the most extreme and toxic partisan gerrymanders we've ever seen. And Roberts said, well, this is a political issue. It's not a judicial issue. I'm going to leave this for the political branch to decide. The political branch caused this problem by trying to entrench themselves in office.
Right.
And Roberts is there saying, well, we can't get in the middle of every dispute about maps. Voters have to figure it out. If voters want to do something about it, they can throw these guys out.
Yeah.
And it's like, Mr. Chief Justice, they entrench themselves into districts that we can't vote them out from. And if it's a political issue, they've made it so that they've got this huge conflict of interest and guaranteed their own elections.
And which branch is the political branch anyhow? This is legislative, right, executive, and judicial. Like, you can't even, drive me crazy.
This is where we need you and the courts to step in on behalf of voters. And, the decisions can just be so disingenuous and unhelpful to solving these important questions. If we're going to solve these problems of representation, we've got to find a way to do it together.
Right.
It's got to be Democrats and Republicans and independents. It's got to be Americans saying, we want to have a majoritarian system. We want to protect the rights of the minority, but majority does rule. And we're not going to stand for anybody playing games with these important principles in order to entrench their own side and try to dominate others, especially if there are fewer of you. It doesn't work. It's fundamentally un-American, and it's not okay.
Yeah.
And huge majorities of Americans believe this. Unfortunately, there are far too many politicians in office, and I would say far too many judges on the bench. And this isn't a Republican or Democratic thing, who don't believe that and who are willing to use their positions to entrench themselves and their side and their allies in power. And it is wrong. What we saw in 2018, what I try to write about in this book, are about citizens taking heroic efforts to stand together and break down these barriers. And I believe that Americans are determined and working really hard to do that. I mean, you quoted, Martin Luther King earlier, and I mean, King also talked about how the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, right?
Yeah.
And I think what a lot of us have learned is that the arc doesn't bend toward justice on its own. It's not natural. It's not automatic. It only bends towards justice when all of us kind of grab it and pull it and push it in that direction. And that there are a lot of people, partisans of all sides, who are willing to pull it the other way. And the arc of the moral universe is a tug of war for the kind of country that we want to live in. And I think most of us want to live in a country defined by fairness and equal representation and one person, one vote, and in a country in which well-meaning, good-intentioned people sit down together and work out the solutions to common problems. And that's what we have to find our way back to. That's what a lot of us are still fighting for.
Your book is called Unrigged, and you talk about the historic blue wave from the last election in 2018. It appears today, and again, polls caveat and who the hell knows what crazy thing is next caveat aside, it does appear likely with someone like Joe Biden, who struggles to say things that make sense to me personally. And I don't mean policy-wise, I mean reality-wise. We could see a red wave very easily could happen where we see most of the nation go towards President Trump and the House go back the other direction. We easily could see this. And this is not me making a political statement. It is sort of the nature of what we do. We tend to careen left and right quite a bit. Is this book still relevant when the election happens? And we'll say, and this is just for example, again, not a political statement, but let's say that President Trump gets over 400 electoral college votes because Biden is just an untenable candidate from Pete's point of view. And the House does turn red and the Senate does stay red. And all of a sudden, we've got this thing, or is this just a byproduct of the 2011 redistricting, you think?
I think that a majority of voters ought to be able to control a majority of seats. And that you have a problem in a democracy when a majority of voters can't translate that into control of a chamber or an office. So if Republicans win enough votes to hold the Senate and the White House and, 400 electoral votes, that's a wave. And parties ought to be able to turn big waves into mandates for action, right?
Yeah.
I think that the problem comes when it's the other way, when the structures and the rules and the rigging and the gerrymandering gets in the way of a majority of voters being able to translate that into a majority of seats. I mean, Democrats did this in Texas to Republicans for a long, long time. I mean, in Texas throughout the 90s and until Tom Daley did his mid-decade redraw in 2005, I guess it was, you had a majority of the congressional seats in Texas going blue, even though a majority of the state was red. So, Democrats have done plenty of this. Republicans did more of it after 2010, and the technology was so much better that they were able to make it last a longer time. It's this wild convergence in 2010 of a Tea Party wave, a redistricting year, a really focused political strategy in a handful of states, and technology that makes it possible to do, and big data that makes it possible to do a better job with this than ever before. So right now we have all these states like, say, Wisconsin. In 2014, in Wisconsin, there was a Republican wave. They should have been able to control, state politics and do all the things Scott Walker and his allies wanted to do. In 2018, there was a blue wave.
Yeah.
And the voters kicked Walker out, and they reelected Tammy Baldwin to the Senate, and they gave Democrats all the statewide offices, and they gave Democratic Assembly candidates more than 200,000 votes over the Democrats. And yet the Republicans still hold 63 of the 99 seats. And the Democrats were able to pick up one seat in a blue wave, not even enough to break a supermajority. And that is where I think we have the problem. When we have 400 seat electoral college waves, everything else is going to go along with it. And I think the system will work itself out. The problem that we've had is we have so many of these super close elections.
Yeah.
Our system just isn't made for it. Especially when you add in all the gerrymandering, all the geographic issues, all the institutional structural stuff.
Right. Yeah. And we don't trust each other when it comes to these things. When people say remove the electoral college system, I would say, look at all the elections we've had for president and how many times the electoral college, gone the opposite way. It doesn't, it's the exception. And just because we know for sure that if New York and California largely decide our elections, there's going to be a whole lot of people that are pissed off because now they'll feel like as if they have no chance, and maybe that wouldn't happen, but I don't want to risk that. I don't want to risk a civil war or the fracturing of our nation because, Montana's like, look, Montana's already pugnacious as hell anyhow. You come in there and start messing around with their rights, they get mad,
Well, it's the other way too, though. It's the other way as well.
Absolutely. Right.
And when there are, more people live in LA County than live in like 17 states.
Yeah. Yeah.
And those 17 states have got 34 senators and LA County's got 2.
Yeah.
So I think we have to find a way to come together and talk about these questions of representation, or else you're right. I mean, no one side ought to get to shove its will down the other side's throat on this. We have to solve these problems together, and we have to talk about them. And if we don't, we could head down a path.
Hey, this is Peteaturner from lionsrockproductions. We create podcasts around here, and if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
We have to solve these problems together, and we have to talk about them. And if we don't, we could head down a path toward violence and illegitimacy. And it's urgent that we find a way to break through the polarization and talk to one another and create a system that actually works.
Yeah. If you look at Orange County where I live, it is bigger than, like there are 28 states that have populations that are bigger than Orange County. That's it. All the rest, the other 20 something states have populations that are smaller than a county.
Right.
And you go south to San Diego and you go north to LA, it is a big, just that part of Southern California is an enormous number of people that they need representation. And Orange County is complicated because you have a lot of blue and red folks. And by the way, I've now eliminated the folks who are green or whatever other color you want to, it is a mess but there are things we can do. When we look at the big issues today, and again, granted, these issues seem to change. Oh, and by the way, I want to say one thing. How many second-term presidencies have claimed a mandate that wasn't really there, too, by the way? We'll put that aside for a second. When we look at these problems, redistricting, better representation of the democracy, and then you compare that to a problem like global climate change, what we're going to do about that. And then also medical care and how we deal with revamping our system there. We've got a lot of big priority issues. How is it possible to even tackle these, especially right now? But let's just say that we get along well enough to pick one or two of these things. Where does representation as a nation and modernizing our legislature, where does that rank with these other big problems?
I think it's at the very top. I don't think we can solve any of the other problems until we fix our representational problems. Our system is not designed right now for compromise. It is not functioning in a healthy manner. And we're not going to get any of the action that anybody wants to see on issues that most of us agree that there's a way forward on, until we incentivize politicians to behave differently. I mean, I think it's almost hopeless until then. I don't care what your number one public priority is. If you don't also prioritize electoral reform and a democracy, you're never going to see any action on your issue.
Yeah, I'm positive that you're right. And even if they do act on it, you're not going to get a resolution that makes sense. I've got a really big prison reform project that I've done here at the podcast. And I'm hearing states talk about it. And what they want are optics, not necessarily action, because action is a little bit scary and dangerous. But these things, these big problems, if we aren't able to, well, I mean, just look right now at
if we don't have solutions that both sides can find a sign onto, what you're going to see is a whole lot of executive orders that get undone the second the other side.
Yeah, we can't govern by executive order. And plus, we don't like kings. We are supposed to be governed by ourselves. And if you have to, because there's this multi-decade long and ever increasing stagnation loggerhead problem in the legislature, the president is left to, in my first 100 days, on day one, I'll do this. But and this is one of my problems right now with the Democratic candidates. There's only a couple left now, but all of them that are legislators and they're going to make this change. Do your job now. Do it now. While you're a senator, while you're a representative, get legislation through that's bipartisan. Make change. You already have the spot. Get to work, but we can't because the system is so grinding and not effective. It's maddening. The other thing is the way the system works right now, it doesn't promote the best person, especially at the presidential level. There's no way that Joe Biden is the best person to represent the Democratic Party and that many tens of millions of people. There's no way that's the guy you're like, that's my guy. I can't wait. And I ask this question a lot. Now I'm going to ask you this question. Is it even possible for you and I to sit down and go, look at these two candidates for president, one's from the right, one's from the left. I'm so excited about both of them. They're both so qualified. I just don't know which one I'll pick.
Well, that's funny, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm almost 50 years old, and I'm trying to think of an election in which people haven't felt like it's an existential threat, one way or the other. And of course, as you look back on some of these, it's kind of ridiculous to think some of them were existential threats, right?
Right. Yeah.
and maybe we'll someday feel the same way about this moment. Everybody who looked at, Bill Clinton versus Bob Dole in 1996, or John McCain and Barack Obama was probably wrong, either one of them, but I think you're right, and it's this high stakes, high polarization. We have these two political parties and they're pretty much binary at this point in time, right?
Yeah.
There's no crossover. When I grew up in Connecticut, and there were liberal Republicans in the state. We were represented by Lowell Weicker in the Senate, who was this Republican who stood up to Nixon during Watergate and who drafted the Americans with Disabilities Act. And you can't even imagine a Republican like Weicker on the scene today. And there were all these conservative Democrats, and you had a system that was sort of, it didn't matter so much if one party or another took power, because there were coalitions between the two of them and crossover that kind of greased the wheels for compromise. And now we have these binary parties, polarized, geographically separate and distinct, with two really fundamentally different outlooks on national identity. And it feels like it's this sort of zero-sum existential crisis every 2 or 4 years. And your side has to get in, or your side will be destroyed. And you can't keep a democracy like that. You just can't.
Is this time, because we often hear like, this is the worst ever this is the worst ever that. And I can name every president and every vice president. I know something about each of them. And I look and I go, is this any worse than, say, the Tammany Hall, Conklin machine era of Congress and, that kind of thing? And that went on for decades. Or is this any worse than, say, the civil rights era in the 60s? And, when was the last time we had multiple open riots with shit on fire, and just, it doesn't seem like historically this is all that bad of a time. Historically low unemployment, highest unemployment ever for women, and wages are going up. There are a lot of good things. We've made a lot of progress, but we sure are really tough on ourselves. Do you have a sense, are things as bad as they seem to be on TV every day, or are we actually, overall? And again, this is not a political statement because it took all of us to get here, but are things as bad as they tend to seem?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that the system was able to work in those other eras, maybe in a way that it's not set up to work now. In the 1960s, we were disunified in many ways, but we were still able to pass the Voting Rights Act and, things like that came together and sort of brought reform around what was right. Even under George W. Bush, the Congress of the United States reauthorized the Voting Rights Act almost unanimously back in the early 2000s. And it's almost impossible to imagine a unanimous vote on behalf of the Voting Rights Act today. I just can't see it. And I think that the situation we were just talking about, these two geographic, highly polarized parties with distinct visions of national identity, hammering at each other in this existential battle every 2 years, had done something to us that it's overwhelming the system. The way that the parties are lined up right now is a mismatch for the way these systems were designed to function, and it could really easily overload these systems. And this is not to say that we're headed towards civil war, or that it's not fixable, or that something can't happen that pulls us back together again, and we look back on this era as just another difficult moment on the road towards something else. But it feels different to me. I didn't, 20 years ago, I didn't worry about going to Thanksgiving dinners and getting into fistfights with members of the family, in a way that it feels like people do now.
It's, yeah. And I know we're coming up at the end of our hour, but I think about, these eras of time, and you just look at like the amendments to the Constitution, and for the most part, about every 10 to 15 years, we were amending something, and also like when we look at founding fathers, just the ability to get enough people to agree to create a nation, is impossible. So when we like, why didn't they solve slavery right away? Like they barely got us all together, like there wasn't a lot of extra room there. As odious and horrible as our slavery history is, we have to also understand like what was possible. And I would say right now, if we had something like slavery, or if we had to get through, the 20th Amendment or the 22nd Amendment, I don't know that we could do it. I don't know that we could get the supermajority together and then the states to ratify. We're in one of the longest periods in our history, between amendments. The last one was in the early 90s. And it was like more of a procedural thing. So when we look at these things and trying to update our government, we have been holding fast for quite some time on the size of the court. It's well over 100 years. It's we are not in a mood to get together as a nation and go in one direction really fast. And yet we seem to be desperate to try to do that. And I don't know what's going to change, but man, I appreciate you writing your book, and I'll leave you the comments to close this out, but everybody should go get Dave's book, Unrigged. I know that I'll be buying it as soon as it comes out, and I'll listen to an audiobook because I like Audible. And just, man, again, thanks. And to whatever thoughts you have on that last little bit on the supermajority necessary to make it a change, to make amendments, to update the court.
Listen, we as a nation are polarized, but we are not as polarized as our politicians, and we're not as polarized as the system forces us to be. Mm. And I know this because I have spent the last couple of years going across the country and following and embedding with all of these groups that are out there doing the hard work of making change. And so I want people to feel optimistic about our ability to cross partisan grounds and work together and solve problems. And I don't want them to feel optimistic because I'm Pollyanna. I want it because there's examples in all of these states, and I write about them, of people getting together behind questions of fairness and democracy around the need for every politician to represent a district that was drawn by the people to generate a fair outcome, not drawn by politicians to entrench themselves. I was out with this mighty moral coalition in Florida that united everyone from Trump voters on motorcycles and the Koch brothers to, former drug dealers just out of prison. And they came together behind a pretty American notion of when a debt's paid, it's paid.
Yeah.
And they restored voting rights to 1.4 million Americans in Florida who had lost their civic voice forever because of a long ago felony that they'd since to serve their time had been released for. I was up in Maine with folks who installed ranked choice voting for their statewide elections because they wanted to be sure that they protected both a longstanding tradition of independent candidates in the state, but also that they didn't have plurality winners with 35, 36% that were making policies most people didn't want. I was out in Idaho and Utah and all of these places where you would imagine that the state legislatures are deeply, deeply conservative, but people wanted centrist solutions on some of these things. And they created change using the ballot box, people of all parties. This can be done. There's a mighty, mighty unrigging that's underway. And I think we ought to all look at this and really believe that when we do put our hands on that arc of the moral universe, we can pull it back towards these American ideals of fairness for everybody.
Man, I love it. I love it. Yeah. And I want to be on that arc, hands on it, helping out. And I think most of us do. Most of us, I mean, you do look at the progress our country has made and where we stand in the world in terms of allowing these things. We're still a beacon. It's just, again, we're pretty hard on ourselves and how shiny our beacon is. It's one of my favorite things to say is when folks talk about the 1%, I'm like, scope back a little bit and look at, you're actually part of the 1% in the world. And we're a place that does go out and help. And there's a lot of good things, but we sure as hell have some work to do. And it starts with all of us kind of saying, let's do this together. I don't care what color shirt you have on. I don't care what color skin I don't care who's in your bedroom. I just care that we all care for one another. Some consensus building is a good exercise in getting some of these things dealt with. And I appreciate you coming on and talking about it. Not easy stuff to get into.
It's a lot of fun, and I am grateful for your voice and for the opportunity to come on and talk about it.